this, but just say like the name, what your position, kind of what the work is that you do, where you do it, your area of expertise, populations you're interacting with, that sort of thing. So we'll do that at the beginning, kind of go down the line, and then like Scott said, from that point on, it could be jumping in and out. You all have your own mics, so you can go back and forth, and it doesn't have to be down the line again. It can just be whoever wants to jump in.
Okay.
My heart's just racing because I was running behind, and then I couldn't find a parking spot.
Always.
Always. Yes. What did you start?
No, I moved to Wichita. So yeah, I moved part time and I started my PhD. So that was the goal, was to work less. So I had time for that. So that just made sense.
Yeah, it's a cost.
We don't have it now, so you're having it.
Yeah.
Overwhelming amount of referrals coming in.
Yeah. And I love it. I love the college though, so I don't see myself completely stepping away, but just helping me with people here.
Do you feel like you might employ others in something now?
I would love to. I think that there's such a need. I mean, I don't want to take it away. So, and I love teaching students. That's actually what I teach in my class is an internship class. And so I would love to have interns even. So as I feel like it's just great as it allows that to come in.
And even if there's no
I wish we could see how many people were streaming in.
Yeah, there's so many practices now that are charging like $20 or $30 for a session. I mean, I know students and so they just whatever they get is money. And then it makes it practice because, you know,
I'm sure he'll have it for after the fact, just for numbers, but
so I would definitely
metrics.
and we provide service to national registry accounts that are 20 and so yeah, I feel like it's kind of a win-win.
That's good. That's awesome. I know that one of our instructors requested his class come, so I'm guessing that's that factor.
Oh, that makes sense.
Just making behavior class. I don't know. We're good here.
You're going to actually try to move one close to you. They think that you can pick them up from the area easily. Just make sure, try to move it closer to you.
I'll just do this.
Yeah, so unless you want to hold it in your the mic in your hand, go ahead and everybody move your stands like to the edge of the table.
They're on. I know that.
Like, had a good turnout. Congratulations.
Coming out today, this is going to be a panel discussion on students and trauma. It's looking at the student experience K through college. And at any level, folks that have experienced trauma, it affects a lot of different people. We brought together some experts today to really discuss how this phenomenon in society affects students, but also what things are being done and can be done to address this issue. So we're excited to have David Condos from the High Plains Public Radio be our moderator today. David will run the panel discussion. We will have time at the end for questions from the audience if you want to ask questions of the panel as well. We are live streaming this on YouTube. Hope everybody's comfortable with that. Back of your head looks like this is going to look. We're going to just get started in just a minute or so. So thanks again for coming.
All right, thank you, Scott, for that introduction and for putting this panel together. Thank you guys for being here. Great to see a good crowd to talk about students and trauma, an important issue. So I'm going to let these panelists introduce themselves, so we'll just go down the line, starting right here, talk about your name, your position, your connection with this world of students in trauma.
Okay, my name's Amanda, clinical professional counselor here in Hayes. I practice part-time at Health and Wellness Services here on campus, and I have a small. I also instruct a couple classes in the counseling department here on campus.
Hi everyone, I'm Raquela Texhorn, and I am an instructor here at Fort Hays State University in the social work department. I have also worked with students K through 12 providing therapeutic services.
I'm Ayanna Hensley, Miss Kansas 2022. I don't have a clinic or work with other instructors and students, but the reality of the situation is I've lived through it. So I get to take a personal approach to the trauma and everything that's surrounded by it.
My name is Sarah Lancaster, and I am an assistant professor in the counselor education department here at Fort Hays. My experiences prior to coming to Fort Hays were in juvenile felony probation, and then I was a school counselor and a social emotional specialist for USD 305.
Good morning, I'm Lindsay Sellers, and I am currently the counseling department chairperson at Salina High School South. I also serve as their PBD director, which stands for Performance-Based Diploma. So my job every day is to work with the top 7 to 10% of students at my high school that are most at risk of graduating with their cohort class.
And I'm Curtis Stevens. I'm Director of Secondary Education for Salina Public Schools. Prior to that, I served as principal of Salina High School South and had a chance to work with Dr. Sellers. My expertise is in general administration, and I'm a former student from Fort Hays State University, so it's great to be back home.
All right, and as Scott said, my name is David Condos. I am a reporter based here in Hayes with High Plains Public Radio and the Kansas News Service. So,
Well, I feel like we're probably biased with all of us working in mental health or having been through trauma and seeing that it's a huge issue. I more specifically work with the college population, and so we see this as really just difficulty adjusting whenever they perhaps have experienced trauma throughout their childhood and then come to a space where maybe they're starting to have their own autonomy in their own environment that they can keep safe. And sometimes that means that their trauma can kind of come flooding to them, and then learning how to process that whenever they maybe haven't been able to do that throughout their life prior to that. And so I definitely think at the higher education level, it's an enormous issue.
I would echo Amanda in that it's a huge issue. And in a K-12 setting, when I think about who it impacts, I would say everyone in that setting. It impacts the students, obviously, but also the teachers in the classrooms, teaching them, their peers, principals, school counselors, really just anyone in that building it has an impact on.
For those of us who like statistics, I'm not a mathematician by any means, but I know some of our brains work that way. It is 60% of children before they reach the age of 18, they've experienced one form of trauma. It doesn't matter how big, how small, it was one form, and then you move forward and it's 1 in 6 have experienced 3 or 4. So that's a pretty big number when you put it into perspective.
yeah, anyone else talk about maybe earlier grades, younger grades? No? All right. And then I think it's important, as you pointed out, Ayanna, to talk about how it can layer on itself. Like you say, that 60% number, maybe experience one type of trauma, but then, that it's common to have more than one. And I guess how can that kind of exacerbate the issue when you have multiple?
It's just a megaphone. It's that ripple effect. You experience one form, and if you're not able to get through that or to process it or have the appropriate support, it'll continue to get worse.
Yeah. And so obviously we're here today to shine a light on this, and there's a lot of more work to be done about bringing these conversations up, but it has maybe gotten to a point where it is talked about more now than it was even just a few years ago. So I guess, what are your thoughts on why this issue has started to come to the forefront?
So I'm sure a lot of people have probably heard about the ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, which I think has probably been one of the bigger things that have been put out into the media. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris was a big promoter of ACEs and what that looks like. And as she was doing the study and working with, she was actually a medical doctor, but working with children, they started to really look at how trauma had affected these children over a lifetime. And so it triples like your lung and heart diseases, just simply from the trauma. So when people are coming into a medical or having an evaluation done medically, a lot of these things are hidden. So it's not like you go in and you can see a broken arm, or it's not like you can go in and you're getting treated because you have a head cold. It's a lot of the hidden things that really take a lot more of that deeper look at an individual, but how that really plays that role on their health throughout their lifetime.
And I know this is a panel discussion, but for the audience, an ACEs score, has any of you ever looked at what the ACEs assessment is? Raise your hand if you know what it is. Okay, so there's several of you who do not. So we, as a school social worker, we have gone in and had some students take these tests. And even for yourself, if you've never experienced what an ACEs assessment is, I would encourage you to take it. There are going to be questions on there such as, is there a divorce in your family? Has anyone ever gone to prison? It's going to talk about sexual abuse. There are a lot of our students who have already experienced that trauma. So just imagine what their parents have also already experienced. And so we are able to look at those scores and better serve the students who are in that building by what that score is. And maybe it's just having the awareness of what has happened to them in their life. Maybe it is to start working on preventative efforts within the home life as well. Because a lot of times our children who come into those school buildings may not feel safe at home. And so they're safe at school, they do well, but here we are sending them back home. And so it cycles. Every time they come back to school, their behaviors continue. Even though you might have gotten it under control, there's Christmas break, you know. So being able to know what that ACEs score can be very helpful.
I'm happy that we've brought up ACEs. So when you're in pageants in the Miss America organization, you have this social impact, a platform, what you advocate for, and mine is actually termed ACEs Low, Overcoming Adverse Childhood Experiences. And to give a personal testimony, ACEs is so relevant, and it was brought to my attention entering college. So it was at post K through 12, and I took the test for the very first time. I scored within the 85th percentile of measurable trauma. I knew I was going through these things to put it in a measurable visual for me spoke a lot. So then you go through the interventions that we're going to talk about a little bit later, but it's important, and it's not just becoming an issue, it's that conversation, it's that recognizing what you've been going through and what others have been going through. And it's all in phases. You start to have the conversation, it's mental health in general, and now you start implementing the interventions and the things that can allow us to overcome those things.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. We're going to talk a lot about how what this means for administrators and teachers and leaders and stuff like that. But I think it's important to note that like a test like that can be important for the student as well, because you're growing up in this family and you've kind of come to accept that context as the reality that you're put into, and you may not even realize that you're in the 85th percentile or whatever the case may be. And so I think that's a good point, that it's also important for the student's journey themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think that's really highly common coming into higher education. A lot of our clients will come in and they will wonder if they have trauma. And then as we start processing what they've been through, it's very clear that maybe they have complex trauma and they've been through quite a bit, but it's their life. And so they haven't necessarily classified it as traumatic or not traumatic. It's just what they've lived. And so I feel like having something like the ACEs to be able to show them, like, this is the reason that you feel this way, and we can help you heal, is a very powerful moment for them.
Yeah, and to normalize what they're feeling is like,
Yes.
well, you're not just feeling this out of left field. There are underlying factors. Yeah. Anyone else thoughts about why this is coming to the forefront?
I'd just like to share, being a school administrator even prior to COVID, we were seeing increases in needs of students in our in our organization, but I think probably the fact that COVID did shut down so many supports, and that schools, the stability that they provide for communities, I think we saw it just really have a deeper impact. And again, it was there before. It isn't something that COVID has brought on, but it definitely it halted so many supports in communities, and it halted the stability that schools will provide to communities. And I think that as we've brought students back into the school setting, it's also it's just made it so much more prevalent for our staff members to understand what is needed to help those students navigate what maybe they would have had some additional supports for prior to COVID, or during COVID when that stopped, gets them back on track. And so that's something that we've really, as administrators and educators, have had to start examining deeper, and what we can do to provide them that daily emergent support in our classrooms, in our hallways, and on our campuses.
Yeah. And so even with conversations like this shining a light on it, a lot of teachers, administrators, even parents can be unaware or in denial about the prevalence of these issues in the students' lives around them. Well, why is that? What are some of the factors that kind of perpetuate that situation?
The first thing that comes to mind is your ability to connect and to empathize. Sharing my message just across the state or in groups like this, people hear what I'm saying, but they're not listening to the subject matter, and it's to no fault of their own. They just don't have an experience that may resonate with them personally that I had gone through, which are the people next to us have gone through, and it's just that lack of empathy that we're working towards. That's always the first thing. You don't live in someone else's shoes, so how can you you can't understand everything that they walk through. So it's just taking down those layers and just being able to recognize that it's their story, but it's still very relevant.
I think there's also a barrier because trauma is really hard to talk about, and I think a lot of times people don't want to believe it's happening around them, and maybe that's happening in their community, and that's happening to the kids that they're working with, and I think that is a difficult step to take, to realize that it's present everywhere.
Yeah. Or even to realize, like, well, if this is true, then I've got to help. I've got to step in and figure out what to do, and that could be a tough mental barrier for somebody who maybe hasn't thought about that before.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, some people that have gotten through it, again, to no fault of their own, the mentality is, well, I went through this and I'm fine, and I didn't have the supports and the services, so if I can get through it, it shouldn't be a big deal for you. You can get through it, and I think you meet some resistance and some barriers in that way.
Another barrier, depending on what community you live in, could be a cultural barrier. Some cultures believe that if there is, let's say, a mental health issue, it stays within the family, and no outside help is sought after.
Yeah, and that gets into the next question I was going to ask. Like, what are some of the drivers of this? I know there's family issues, cultural, could be religious, generational. What are some of those factors that you guys see?
A lot of it was a social economic class for me. My parents did their absolute best to provide for me, and there were shortcomings, and those shortcomings then affected me growing up and just my personal development throughout that situation. But there's so many gray areas. It's never black and white, and that's something that we're running into. It's such a big problem. How do we get from A to Z without looking at A to Z? It's A, B, C. There's so many steps within that process, and it's so overwhelming, but poverty was a really big one for me.
Yeah, I think for me too, I was had started doctoral coursework before I really recognized, I guess, what trauma was, because I used to think of trauma and only in the context of people that had gone to war. And when you start really reading about it, it's it's financial issues, it's housing, it's lack of access to medical care, it's lack of access to food. So many students, unfortunately, don't know at the end of the day where they're going home to, if they've had to move, if mom or dad has been picked up during the day and been sent to jail. It's so much more than just someone went to war, and that certainly is trauma too, but I think just getting people to realize and understand all the different little things that you maybe didn't think of that add up to create, various traumatic experiences.
Anyone else with thoughts on that? Yeah. I mean, I guess back to kind of the cultural piece that you were talking about, Raquela, I think it's interesting, like right now we're here in Hayes, we're in rural Kansas, that's an area that you all do your work in. I guess, are there specific barriers in small towns, in rural culture, rural communities? Like what are some of the kind of barriers or obstacles you see in that world that are kind of maybe not unique to that world, but maybe more prevalent?
I think one of the big barriers is the access to services at times. I work with a lot of some college students as well as I'm not in a super small town. I'm in Salina, but we struggle at times even just with mental health therapy appointments. And that isn't just necessarily having the people available, which is one barrier, but also students getting to appointments, parents being able to get students to appointments. We have a lot of students who need case managers. They're not people, I know everyone is dealing with this, but there are not people to hire for some of these positions. And so we have students on wait lists at times, and I would say that system is getting better as we're getting some of this information out there and putting systems into place within different organizations, but that has definitely been a barrier that I've worked through, and not even in what I would consider a super small town.
Right, and then there's so many small communities outside those larger communities, and in my area, it could be up to a 3-month wait to get in to a mental health center, and that's not okay. I mean, if someone is coming in with a crisis, they need to be seen, and then just the follow-up services that come along after that. So, like they said, the lack of being able to provide professionals and have those professionals within those agencies available to those who need those services is a problem.
Yeah, and if the mental health system is already facing these overloads in towns like Salina and Hayes, just imagine the barriers that somebody faces in a town of 500 people where they would have to drive an hour even to get to those resources. Yeah.
I feel like in higher education we see the students that are coming to college, and this is the first time that they're able to get mental health services, because here at Health and Wellness our services are free of cost, or free from cost for students. And so a lot of times that's what we see, is them coming in knowing, hey, I've needed to go to this probably since 5th grade, but we didn't have the resources, or maybe my parents didn't believe that mental health was something that needed to be prioritized, and now they have the option to be able to go do that. And so it's pretty incredible how motivated we can see our students be too, because they've been feeling that way for a really long time, and they're ready to not feel that way anymore.
Yeah. And so when you see students come to you with these issues, I guess what does that look like in a student's life? Like, what are the mental, physical manifestations of trauma in students that have experienced it?
Well, I guess what we would see from an administrative side is students that are in crisis, just trying to get through their day, making sure that they have the resources that they need, but also you see that, I always believe discipline is a form of communication, and disciplinary issues become a form of communication. So misbehavior in a classroom, sometimes very frustrated, upset, needing those needs met and trying to figure out how to get that out and communicate that. It wasn't lost on us when we would work with students who are in crisis or exhibiting some of these, these factors, that they end up coming to the office through frustration. Starts out with that. Not all the time. Sometimes it's in the counseling center, but they're trying to get through their day and get their needs met in some ways, and they're not always able to do that. And I think some of that also has helped us in the schools recognize the need to create hope, to respect power, to give those incremental emphasis of effort as that student is navigating the complex day with all of that trauma, and giving them a way to kind of let some of that out, but also have some stability in their day. And so you see it in all kinds of forms, but misbehavior, when you're a school administrator, there's usually, I use that iceberg metaphor, there's a layer under that surface, and you're trying to understand what that student is experiencing and going through for all the other time outside of the school day. And so having those kind of supports and thinking about that, it is incredibly important for educators, administrators, and counselors who initially are just getting that first issue that comes to them without understanding those other pieces. I think sometimes that's a mask that you have to remove to get to.
And I think it's important for everyone to realize there is a reason for that behavior. What is the reason? They're not just acting out to act out. Trauma is going to cause emotional dysregulation, cognitive impairment. It's going to mess with them physically. So we need to be able to understand why are they acting out and then go from there.
Absolutely.
I would add too, and sometimes with the population I work with, a lot of times we think of outbursts or we think of, major behaviors that they would get sent out of a classroom for, but a lot of times what I see is shut down. Like the literal just not doing work, the sleeping in class. They can't, when they have those demands placed on them of what a real school day should look like, that is too much for their body to handle. And I just see a lot of the shutdown. So not only is it the things that are getting sent out of the classroom, if we're truthful about it, sometimes it's those kids that you're never going to see in the office with a discipline referral. It's just going to be they're simply not performing in school.
Or attending
Yes.
because of other barriers and things that they're dealing with.
In terms of a mold, I think I fit that one significantly more. I was a good kid. I had good grades. I wasn't ever outwardly aggressive by any means. There was no happy medium. I wasn't going to do class that day. I was sleeping. I had a second grade teacher who let me sleep because she knew I needed to. And then I was over-rambunctious, had to be the class clown, and there was no in-between. Neither were overly negative, but where did I fit in that mold? And that's where I got lost. I got lost in the education system. I wasn't a red enough flag. There was red flags in there. It just wasn't bright enough for an educator to recognize that. But that was however many years ago. At this point, I'm getting a little bit older, comparatively speaking. And so now we're having those conversations, and we're seeing that it's not the black and white, it's everything in between that matters too.
I feel like in higher education we see a similar presentation. We have students coming in because maybe they have shut down, maybe it just has been too much for them moving into the dorms and being overstimulated by peers, but then also having to be self-motivated to kind of get through the day and get through classes. And so maybe their roommate brings them in because they haven't gone to class or left their dorm in a week. Or maybe it's the other end of the spectrum, that they are finally feeling like they're in a safe place and they just don't want that to go away. So they're trying to do all the things all the time, and they've gotten themselves to a point of such high anxiety that they can't function. And so really trying to help them understand how their brain is working and that their amygdala is very activated. That part of their brain that became reacted with the trauma is so activated that maybe not very many things outside of their little space feel safe, but that we can learn how to self-regulate and we can learn how to navigate through this new environment and figure out how to process that trauma.
Yeah. Anyway, anyone else with thoughts about how this manifests, or even we've gotten into this next question a little bit, like what does that look like for the day-to-day challenges that students face when they're experiencing this?
It makes daily tasks so much harder. I remember waking up my poor mom in kindergarten, and it was tying my shoes. If there was any form of inconsistency or I had a little bump in the way that I looped the bunny ears, it was the end of the world. And it was just that lack of consistency, and it is a manifestation of, even though it shouldn't be a big deal, everything else that I had going on made it astronomical to me.
That's something I feel like I hear from so many college students. They're like, why is it so easy for my friends? Why is it so easy for my friends to go to class and to join the clubs and to do all the things? And I am crying in a bathroom stall, having an anxiety attack. And so that's where I think it's so important that students, as early as we can, are educated on the impacts of trauma so that they realize that the reaction that their body is having is not because they're just weird. It's because it's trying to keep itself safe, and it hasn't always been successful. And so just trying to normalize those behaviors and those moments, and that it's not that they're not as strong as their peers.
I think
Go ahead.
just being able to learn what they're there to learn, they aren't able to do. They can't check their personal lives at the door and come in and learn math or science. So whether it's manifesting in a shutdown or they're destroying a classroom, they're just not in a space where they're able to to just learn the content. We can't do it.
When I would work with students, usually those who are in the high school, there are a lot of things that can trigger your trauma to come back to you, and we just aren't aware of what those triggers are. And as Amanda talked about the amygdala, that is your emotional command center, so it is going to tell you to either fight, flee, or stand in fear. And your hippocampus in your brain is what stores all your memories. So your amygdala doesn't understand that you're not going through your trauma right now, but something triggered that memory, and so it's going to give you all of those feelings again. And so I had to work with students on, you're in a safe place, you're just having, you've been triggered by those memories.
Yeah, and it was a good point, like someone was saying earlier, is that it's, or I guess it was you, Ayanna, was saying, like, it's not necessarily these red flags. It's like, and it doesn't look like one thing, which I imagine makes it that much harder to identify, right? I mean, that kind of reinforces why it's important to have these kind of conversations with teachers and other leaders, right? Yeah.
Don't ever brush off the small signs. If they're willing to give you those small signals and the small indications, that's all that they can give you, but that doesn't mean that there's more underneath that. They just don't know how to adequately put it into words. A third grader trying to describe to you everything that they're going through, they don't have the vocabulary or just the cognitive awareness to place that into a sentence that you can interpret. So it's those small signs, they matter.
And I would add to that too, a lot of times that's their normal. So the things that they're going through at home that some of us would probably be appalled to, that's their normal life. That's what they go to, that's how they've been raised, that's what they live in every day. So they don't know any different. It's not like they've gone home to this really chaotic home one night and then the next night they go home and there's fresh baked cookies after school and a homemade meal and everyone's sitting down to chat at dinner. It's really the only thing they know. So how would they have the cognitive ability to tell us what's going on when that's just their normal?
I would say it's usually freshman or sophomore year of college that they recognize that that's not normal. You know, whenever they're starting to be around their peers and their peers' family members, then it starts to be like, oh, not everybody grew up that way. And not everybody had those interactions. And not everybody struggles with a parent the way that I do. And so I feel like it's much later than those early elementary years.
Yeah. And so kind of shifting to looking at some solutions for this issue. So they say, you know, the first step to fixing a problem is to recognize it. And like we've said, there's still a lot of work to do as far as getting that recognition. I guess, in your view, what could happen to move more teachers, administrators, parents, other leaders to recognize this as the big issue that it is?
There's so much that goes into it. Oh my goodness. I always say human connection. For me personally, that's what got me through a lot of my circumstances. It was always the one individual or multiple individuals at different phases of my life that left the most impact. And so it's teaching educators and mentors, other people within the community that, you know, that 5 extra minutes matters. And that 5 extra minutes every other week, it mattered. And so there's just so many things that you can implement. The first thing and the easiest thing that comes to mind is just to be a human and to connect with them outside of just what they're going through, but just as a face-to-face, having a normal conversation too.
There's actual clinical evidence that shows that positive relationships can help us heal from negative ones. And so even in a classroom, if you feel like it's an endless task and you have to send them back to that chaos, you're still making an impact because that positive relationship is going to change their life.
And it helps with the younger ages. There's a lot of liability. You can't look at a K through 5 and say, your home life is not normal. That's negative. You're in the wrong. Your situation, your home life is in the wrong. That's their normal. So it's finding the balance of you can be in that situation, but you can be steadfast in who you are and what you're going to be and the things that you want to aim towards. So it's that fine line of drawing attention to it, showing that it is not in fact normal, but that's okay that it's your normal. Here's the next steps. Here are the next relationships that you can build to get you out of that.
Rita Pearson, a famous educator who does this TED Talk on every kid deserves a champion. One of the things she says is, it's hard to learn from somebody you don't like. And it's so true. And so building relationships, it can't be stressed enough, but to that point too, seeking to understand, slowing the thinking process down for the teacher, the administrator, the counselor, the student, and working through challenges to get them kind of out of that fight mechanism and really get to process the challenge that's right in front of them. And I guess staff development efforts that help teachers, again, a stressful job, we understand that, but slowing things down and processing, sometimes you'll see situations, and we've all been through them in K-12 education as a student and as a teacher, but, teachers telling a student to do something versus, hey, you could ask. You don't always have to, to tell. Also, helping explain to the student the why of procedures, of policies when those come up. And ultimately, just empathizing with that student and the circumstances they're in. All of those things are items we like as adults. We expect it as students. Everybody gets dignity, but that extra step of showing compassion and slowing down the thinking to help process to get what it is you want. I think that's every interaction we have with students is an opportunity to teach that and for us to learn from them as well.
I just talk about, when I talk to schools, about being intentional about creating relationships. And what I mean by that is that, I would say, to a wrestling coach, for example, it's not hard for you to have relationships with your wrestlers because you work with them after school, you have extra time with them, but what about the other kids in your class that aren't on your wrestling team? What are you doing to create, to make a relationship with them? And I did a lot of work around restorative practices, which is taking that extra step. I'm a huge fan of time in the morning when they first come in, to have like a morning meeting and to just talk, because when Ayanna was talking about, like, it's not always big, huge red flags. Sometimes it's little things. Are you giving them an opportunity to tell you the little things? Are you asking them, it doesn't take very long to ask at the beginning of every day, how was your night? How are you feeling about today? Do you have anything going on this weekend? And just, again, being intentional about asking those questions and creating that space. And I think that can go a long way.
And coming from a different sector of the problem, you can help the child and you can help them get through their situation, but their situation at home isn't going to change until there's other resources that infiltrate that trauma and chaos. So I've been working with several different groups just being in my role, and sometimes it's helping the family with food stamps. Sometimes it's helping them find outlets to make their situation just a little bit more secure. Parents don't want to cause their children trauma. That's not within the brain wiring. They want to be there and they want to be supportive. Give them the resources to do so. And so it's talking to the children, but also giving outreach and resources to those who are seeking it.
Oh, I would just say that I'm going to piggyback off that too. I do truly believe that parents of the children that they send to us every day want the best for their child. It is truly just a matter of they're probably doing the best that they can with what they have too. And so I think that is an important piece, and a lot of times that does fall within the school because we're the ones that have those children every day under our roofs. And so even though we have students that struggle or children that struggle and parents that we know are struggling, I always try to go into a situation with a student or a parent knowing that parent truly wants what's best for their child. They sometimes just don't have the resources or the knowledge to know what needs to be done to deal with the situation or even their situation at home. But I think that's a great point that you bring up, that every single parent, if you've had a child and you're a parent and have a child in your home, you want what's best for that kid. You truly do.
I go back to just my situation. My mother loves when I talk about this stuff, but I was a result of a teen pregnancy. She was barely able to sustain herself, let alone another child brought into the world. One is full of energy as I had. And she did her very best. There was outlying circumstances that she struggled with, but until she had left the situation and did better for herself, there was no way that she could be better for me. And so she sought out those parenting classes. She didn't know how to be a parent at 18 years old. No one really knows how to do that. The first time you're a parent, you still don't even know what you're doing. It doesn't matter what age you're in. And so she did her best to learn and understand. And I mean, she went to that class once or twice a week, and I, being the age that I was, 3rd, 4th grade, noticed the difference. in the healthy dynamic that we began to cultivate and live up until this point.
I think it's important to remember too that if parents have experienced their own trauma and not necessarily healed from that, their brain is not going to allow them to use the rational thinking to be able to make those vital decisions for their child. And so that's where it does become like just really trying to help the whole family so that the parent can help the child because they do want to. I mean, I've never worked with a parent that did not love their child.
They're just as human as we are.
Yeah, and you all have already started to get into this next question, but once the teachers, administrators, the parents, the leaders in these students' lives realize that this is an issue in the students that are around them in their life, what else can they do to become part of the solution? Like what are some tangible things?
I think, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think it's good practice to bring the parents in and work on a plan, not only that they're going to cultivate within the school system, but something for them to take home and also work towards. That way it's going on in both environments that the child is in, and all those systems are working together. I have seen a lot of success with that.
Positive reinforcement and accountability. How can you practice something that you've never had to utilize before? So it's working with the parents, working with the entire family dynamic, giving them a couple positive reinforcements to work on every week, every month, coming back and reporting what they've been working on, some things that they've noticed. Very small, like I said, it mattered, and it was a huge difference in my life and others as well.
I guess I'd add too, along with family engagement, is helping the student really develop a vivid plan for the future and a direction and a goal, and setting that with the parents, setting that with the student, but also kind of benchmarking incremental success towards that goal is important. And I've never seen a time where the school, the parent, the student don't sit down and they have a conversation. I'll be the first to tell you I'm not a fan of the word when they say a SIT meeting, student improvement team meeting. I don't really know that it's just student. I think it's improvement could be school improvement, all of us together. And so shifting that focus necessarily just away from it being about a student and something that needs to be planned and corrected for the future to family engagement and a brighter future with incremental success being developed. That, when I see those three parties come together and have deeper conversations, I think parent-teacher conferences are one of these items in schools that need to change. The subjects about what they're talking about need to move from here's how your student's performing or not performing to really here's a plan that we're all going to work together to find success for students. I don't believe there is such thing as a bad student. I think students sometimes make poor choices, but I think we've got to shift the way we work together, and part of that includes by changing the name of the meeting from student improvement team to perhaps school engagement, a group of family members coming together for a future to plan for that student. And there's opportunities to do that, but we really have some work to do in public education to change our conversation and really shift students into thinking not only about what they're experiencing, but also what they could experience, and helping them have a plan getting to that goal.
I think just to echo that too, collaboration between student and the stakeholders in the school, but also community members. I was very fortunate. We were talking a little bit before this panel started. I was fortunate to work with some really phenomenal social workers. And I was able to do my job as a school counselor, but a social worker, I was able to get the parents set up on maybe an SED waiver or mental health services for their child, or food stamps, or anything that they needed to help them be more successful. We have child abuse prevention services in Salina that do offer the parenting classes that we could offer to parents. And I also think there's been more of it. The middle school I was in was one of the first in the Salina district to kind of pilot it, and I think it's taken off. Mental health was brought into the school. So then you remove that barrier of having to get them to appointments after school. They aren't missing appointments. They get that service at the school. So I just think being able to see more of that, incorporate more of that would really, be a benefit to everyone.
That's awesome.
just to kind of add the higher education side of things, I have a lot of students that I see that have experienced extreme trauma, and they will say that they don't have any plans after the age of 20 because they didn't actually think they were going to make it that far. And so nobody had ever asked them, and they just were trying to get through the day. And so I think it's so wonderful to think about having these meetings to instill hope in these students and help them to see that they do have a future ahead of them, and it's not always going to feel like that.
There's a future and it won't look like their peers. All of us have chosen a different path to life. That path is still the same end goal, but it looks so different for everyone. So I can think of going into high school what I wanted to do. That had since changed 5 or 6 times before I've decided what I'm actually going to do. And just instilling that it's okay if it looks different. It's okay if it looks unconventional. It is your truth and it's your way to get there.
And I would say in the schools, we are working hard. This goes back to one of those topics of creating that hope and having a plan. And your plan can change. We're great with turning corners and making changes. But some of that can start at a really young age. We're working a lot, I know in high schools across the state on what they call an IPS or individual plan of study, which you probably wouldn't link to trauma because people look at that and think, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? But really, those two things are a lot more interconnected than you think because that is what creating hope looks like. You can do, you can be, you can go out and have a life and a journey that's going to be just yours, but it can look like anything you want. So I think sometimes we forget when we're in our everyday lives, this track, we have to talk about your career, or your classes, or what you're taking. This is the mental health, social, emotional side, but those things are so interconnected in creating that hope and getting people to see what their future self really can be.
And I would echo too that part of that individual plan of study or finding out what you like, what you don't like, it's just as equally important about finding out what you don't like, right? What you don't want to do, what you don't want to be, how you want to remove yourself from maybe a set of circumstances to something better. And I think of a time when I was in driver's ed and I was weaving a little bit because I was still learning how to drive, and my instructor said, hey, look 7 seconds down the road so you won't weave back and forth so he wouldn't get sick. I imagine is why he thought that. But as I think about the individual plan of study and looking toward the future, if there is not a vivid picture of what success looks like, if there is not progress of them making kind of an opportunity to explore what they like and what they don't like, and that's not vivid, it's very difficult for students to understand the why of what they are studying and the reason to get up and go to school every day. So the more vivid we make that, I think it helps us connect some of these pieces. It helps our parents buy into maybe a program that they're engaged in. And I will always say this, most of our career plans that are successful are never A, B, C. They're sometimes A, Z, B, X, and then back to D. And you have to be okay with that. And so that's the only, piece that I would caution about individual plans of study and working with students from trauma, any student in general, is that it is not ever only linear. There's a lot of combinations. And the more we make that vivid for them, I think the better that they buy in and engage into the school process.
Yeah, I've worked with some high schoolers who are so fixated on what they didn't want to be because of the trauma they've experienced. And so when I started working with them on asking them, what do you like to do? What is something you like to do during your downtime, or maybe even when you're frustrated, what are some things you do? What are your outlets? Whether it be, I had one who liked to create music, one who was a fantastic artist, painting. And so once you start to open up that door and let them know it's okay to figure out who you want to be and not be so fixated on who you don't want to be, I've seen so many students flourish.
Yeah. And so you're talking about some of these solutions. I guess looking forward, what, in your view, are some of the barriers that could prevent these solutions, prevent society or communities from addressing this issue, and how might you see those barriers be overcome?
I think awareness is a big barrier, and acceptance, understanding that it's okay to ask for help. In our lifetime, are going to need to ask for help in some area. And just knowing that it is okay, despite what maybe society says or your friend group says, to reach out for that help, because there are those resources out there. People will help you. But stigma, it's real.
I would say communication, face-to-face communication, not asynchronous communication, when it comes to options. And, you know, a lot of the barriers that exist, whether it's in a school system, whether it's in the mental health organizations in a community, is navigating and connecting resources together through communication. And I think sometimes we're more apt, and I'll own this as a former teacher in the classroom, sending an email versus maybe having a face-to-face conversation with that parent. You know, we read emails in the mood that we're in sometimes, and sometimes that's not always good. But picking up the phone, having a face-to-face conversation, making the engagement and the communication, having a stronger nexus between those two, and helping kind of connect need with resource.
Anyone else thoughts on barriers and overcoming them?
When working with students in high school, and we didn't have this when I was going in school, but it is so hard for some of these students now to even communicate or speak about what is going on because they're used to hiding behind a screen. And so socially, it's hard. And we need to find a way to be able to break that barrier with communication, proper communication for our generation now and the upcoming generations.
Yeah, all right. What, did you have something?
Kind of. It's very encompassing of everything that we've talked about today. Ultimately, it's that idea that you can't take them out of the circumstance they're in, young adult, grown adult, or a child, but you can help instill the coping skills for them to get out of it on their own, but with support. So they're not doing it completely by themselves, but you're not pushing them through it, because how are they going to learn? They don't learn what they were up against or what to move forward while doing so. It's just finding that happy balance and holding their hand, being supportive, but not carrying them through it.
All right, well, I'm going to skip to the last question so that we have time for potential Q&A from the audience. So we've covered a lot of sobering topics today. This is some heavy stuff. What could each of you, or as many as want to share, could you share kind of a success story? Like what kind of gives you some hope from something from your experience?
I feel like I've seen a lot of success stories. I feel like people are resilient creatures, and it's amazing to be able to watch them grow. One person comes to mind. I started working with them whenever they were 15, and they had been in quite a few different foster homes, and rights had been completely relinquished with parents, and they were so angry whenever I got them, and they were getting into physical altercations pretty much daily at school, and it was, I mean, ISS, OSS, they weren't in school very much just because of their struggles, and so we were able to start processing things because they got placed in a home that was safe and consistent, and they started to feel safe after some time. And as we were able to work through therapy, we were able to figure out some emotion regulation. And I remember the first time this person came to session and said, "This girl bumped me in the hallway, and normally I would have turned around and punched her. I glared at her, and I took a deep breath, and I walked to class." And I was so proud of her. And so I ended up working with her for quite some time, and she's now a sophomore in college. And she was a person that said, "I will not make it past 18. I'm not going to have life after 18. And she is now a sophomore in college. She's 21, and she is taking her time with college and working and healing and setting boundaries with people and figuring out what healthy and unhealthy relationships look like in adulthood. And I do believe success can happen.
A lot of times we see even the media and just maybe even the communities highlight the negative stories, but please remember there are always so many positive stories that happen around us. And I can't even name one specific one that I've worked with, but there have been so many students that I have worked with that come in there and you see them at their worst, right? They don't feel like they can go on anymore. They've had suicidal ideation. They've done self-harming. But by the end of your practice working with them, you have seen them grow in their own self, understanding what coping is for them, because it looks different for everybody, and for them to be able to utilize those coping skills when they're not in your office or not with their mentor. Maybe they have a mentor and they haven't gone to therapy. But please remember, there are so many positive stories, and like it has been spoken about several times today, an empathetic relationship is so important. If that person feels safe, you will see them make strides in a positive, healthy direction.
I'll keep going down the line. This is actually a really recent story. It was my first middle school visit as Miss Kansas, and middle schoolers are scary. They're figuring out what they like, what they don't like, if they like you or not, if they're going to appreciate or even listen to your message, let alone sit there patiently and endure it. And I got an opportunity to talk about faith. It was at a Catholic school. And I went in anticipating a full, everyone's going to love me, rah, rah. The beginning of the presentation, absolutely not. It was very hard to get the 8th graders, especially, to be engaged in what I was talking about. And it was a stereotypical, oh, there's a rainbow after the storm. And it was my fault for making it a little bit cheesy, but we navigate that. I learned my lesson, we're moving forward. And I finally got to the part where I could tell my story. People don't take you as serious as they should when you have this crown and this sash on. And not only that, but they sparkle. And walking into this middle school, it was this, they thought I was very superficial. And I started to tell my story, and I was going down the timeline, and to watch children, not just children, middle schoolers who are being very hard on you, start to lean forward, and their jaws are starting to drop, you hook them. Well, there's this individual, and at the beginning of the presentation, she was one of those that was being ruthless, trying to get everyone to posse around her and to not pay attention, to think this is a joke. And she had made a comment. She says, you know, why am I here? I'm from the streets. I'm raised and born. I'm from the streets. There's no getting out. I don't want to listen to this. That light bulb, I saw a challenge, and I was going to do my best that day. And by the end of the conversation, by the end of the presentation, I got her as well as a few other children to come up to me and to tell their stories. That my story had impacted them enough to be brave and to communicate something that they didn't think they could communicate outside of jokes and to make fun of their situation. So to have them be vulnerable with me, then that opened the door for other educators. Their principal had even made a comment, I have never heard these children talk about these things. And so to have that breakthrough, to me, was just a nice, lighthearted, what I'm doing is important, but these children are starting to understand it. I don't get to watch them grow up into who they're going to be, whatever that is for them. But I do know that I was able to plant a seed, and a seed that is going to be able to flourish into that specific individual's flower or fern, whatever they choose to be.
Fortunately, lots of success stories, which is great. But as far as something specific related to, having empathy, being intentional about relationships, being intentional about creating space, I was in an elementary school one morning doing a circle, and it wasn't my first morning with that group. They'd had time to kind of get to know me, and it had become a safe space. And a girl, I just asked, how was your night? That's all I said. And they were going around, and when it got to her, she talked about a domestic violence situation. And so she said, she kind of explained a little, and then she said, that's all I want to say about that. And so we just moved the circle along. And after I pulled the 2 teachers in the room aside, and I said, you need to get her, to the school counselor today to find out what's going on. She'd been in a situation for the whole previous school year prior to me asking, how was your night? And her responding. And they were able to get her services and kind of put some things in place for her at school, and reach out to mom and see if mom needed services. But that to me is just a testament of how important it is to make that space and create that time. Because if you give them an opportunity, I fully believe that they'll tell you, they'll talk to you, and then you can start the process of really being able to help them.
So I have lots and lots of success stories, and fortunately in my program, I get to see a lot of kids come from behind and still make it to the finish line. And if not, we always have a plan B. And so sometimes the plan Bs are honestly more heartwarming than the ones that actually get there on time, because they've had to put in a little bit of extra, and it hasn't always been easy along the way. But one thing that I always tell my students, and I told some parents this, is that everyone has a different a different path in a different way, and they're on a different track, and that's okay. And I would be remiss to not also say that I remind my students almost daily that social media is not what success looks like, because we fight that every day, and you see the perfect, you see the good, you see the smiling, you see, you know, all of the vibrant good on social media, and that is not what any of our lives look like. And so success looks different for every single person that walks this earth, and I want my students to always know that your path is okay, and that your path is good, and it's going to look different than the next person. So I'll end on that.
Gosh, I should just end on that. I don't want to go after her after hearing that. That's great. One thing I think is every now and then as a principal, I get an email, and it's a voice from the past. It might be 10 years ago, it might be 5 years ago, and there's usually several attributes that you hear in it, but one of them is, I'm sorry we spent so much time together. I get that. But they want to share that they were successful. And so there's that good that's there. And you get it, like I said, it doesn't come instant. And in an age where we like to have our posts made, we like to have all of our likes put up there on a meter. We want it instant. Like when we cook our food at home, we want it instant sometimes not. But for students, it isn't, and it's long work, and you don't always see everything come together right away. And unfortunately, sometimes you don't. But I do think one of the takeaways from hearing this panel and the individuals that have spoken today, it's okay to not be okay sometimes. And it's okay to be vulnerable. And as Mrs. Sellers mentioned, Facebook doesn't show vulnerability a lot. And I think our students, in order for our staff to recognize that, in order for our students to kind of come together, students are like mirrors, you know, they reflect the adults that are around them. And I think it's good for our staff to sometimes say, look, I'm not doing okay today, but we're working on ourselves all the time, and we're growing. And those emails that I would get, usually there's a story in there about growth. And it's those little things from time to time that kind of just keep you going and recognizing your work is not instant.
All right, well, we have maybe just a minute or two. If anyone has questions, you can raise your hand, and I will bring you this mic. Any questions? Yes, all right, hold on.
Hi, I was wondering what materials or books help you have a deeper connection with trauma or learn more about trauma. Especially as a future educator, I would like to know more about trauma through books or through materials.
I would highly recommend Building the Bonds of Attachment by Daniel Hughes and The Whole Brain Child. Those are probably the two books that I feel like really taught me the most about trauma in the beginning. Yeah.
I would say I would look at anything by Lori Desautels if you're going into education. She really connects trauma in the brain specifically to educators. She's got a website with tons and tons of free resources. She's amazing. I also like anything by Bruce Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry. So if you could look at, I'm trying to think.
The Child Called It.
Yeah, boy raised
as a dog.
As a dog. The boy raised as a dog. I don't know who wrote Ghost of the Nursery. If you just want to know more about trauma from birth, that's a good one. Also, so is Body Keeps the Score.
And I'm an old school disciple of Jim Fay, Love and Logic. So.
Northwest Kansas with high risk, usually high level felony adjudications. I'm wondering, just to play on the name of the topic a little bit, but for those kids who should be students who aren't students, mostly the kids who I work with, who's probably less than 10% of them actually in school, who should be in school, have been signed out of school, have been referred to some sort of a GED or something like that due to issues in schools, whatever. What, and using kind of COVID as like this pre and post, because it was such a traumatic experience for so many people, both kids and adults alike, what type of things have been done in schools, particularly now post-pandemic, if we could so call it that, in a sense to go to doors and bring kids back in, especially these high-risk, at-risk kids who have just fallen through the cracks. I think it's one thing COVID has exposed are these holes in our systems, and it's been very easy to lose track of these kids as they were away for so long, and now like getting them back in, and that's something for justice-involved youth that we're really struggling with, is getting them back in the door. So, sorry for the longer question.
That's all right.
No, I think that's the $1 million question. I mean, we talk about that. I teach school counseling students each week, and that's, I mean, I'll let Dr. Sellers and Dr. Stevens speak on it more because they're still in the trenches, so to speak, but that's become a huge, truancy's become a huge issue since COVID, and I wish I had an answer for you, but I do not, so maybe they can.
I would just kind of circling back to in every situation where you can bridge the need with a resource. So unfortunately, you know, schools will have students that either the criminal justice system involvement, or they have dropped out, or they have signed out, whatever the case. I always tell students they still need an individual plan of study. They still need to be thinking about the future. It may not be that it is a four-year college. It may be that we have to line them out with the Kansas Workforce One program. We have to get them into either a Job Corps program, something that allows them to learn a skill. A skill is something that once they have that, they can't take that away. And finding students, that has been very challenging. As I mentioned earlier about the destabilization of communities when schools closed down and students went on to virtual schools. And, you know, I'll have parents call sometimes and say, well, what do you think about this virtual school? Is this a good fit? And I remind them that, you know, every virtual school is not the same. And so getting those students back in some way, somehow, or finding a way for them to get their skills, that is the tough work that we work with all kinds of social agencies in doing that, and the work is never done. In your particular field, I think that working with the local educational institution and saying, look, we understand that this student may have had behaviors that kept them from being in the school. What is an alternate route? What are some other possibilities? One of the silver linings of COVID is that we were able to figure out ways to educate differently, not necessarily better, but in a different manner. And I think that's opened up schools' eyes a little bit of that. One, students can leave your organization. What are other ways you can reach back to them? I do believe in the state of Kansas, we need to have a stronger conversation about that student that does not find success and what has to happen with different agencies to ensure that they are able to build a future plan for success. Because whether they have success or not, they're still going to have that need to take care of themselves, et cetera. And so the more training, Job Corps programs, the pooling of agencies, when you think of social services, Louis Sullivan, former U.S. Health Secretary, said, think of boats, not houses. Houses have walls. Boats pool resources together. And that's an area that we still have of a need in the state of Kansas.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, if not, thank you again for being here. Thank you to the panelists. And thank you to Fort Hays State for facilitating the conversation. So have a great day.